Have you ever wondered what happens when two fierce rivals in the ring discover a connection they never expected? In today's story, we dive into the lives of Chris and Diego, two professional wrestlers who began as bitter opponents in the world of wrestling. But outside the ring, their rivalry evolves into something deeper, something that challenges everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. This is a story about love, acceptance, and breaking barriers in a world where appearances often mean everything. Stay with us until the end to see how these two men fight not only in the ring, but for the love they never saw coming. If you enjoy stories that blend intensity, passion, and romance, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss another incredible tale like this. Now, let's dive into the story. When a wrestler fell in love. The roar of the crowd was deafening, the arena alive with energy as thousands of fans chanted their favorite names. I stepped into the ring, the bright lights blinding for a moment as I soaked in the atmosphere. My name is Chris Michaels, and for the past 7 years, I had built a reputation as one of the fiercest wrestlers in the business. My persona, the Titan, was all about domination and power, and the crowd loved every second of it. But tonight wasn't just another match. It was personal. My opponent, Diego the Panther Ramirez, was everything I wasn't. Where I relied on brute strength, he was agile and cunning, dancing around his opponents like he owned the ring. His fans adored him, and his cocky grin only added fuel to the fire of our rivalry. Diego stood on the opposite corner, his muscular frame glowing under the spotlights. His long, dark hair was tied back, and his piercing brown eyes seemed to lock onto mine with a mix of disdain and challenge. He raised his arms, taunting the crowd as they erupted into cheers. I clenched my fists, the tension between us palpable. Diego and I had faced each other in the ring countless times, each match more intense than the last. But something about him always got under my skin. It wasn't just his arrogance or the way he loved to showboat. No, it was something I couldn't quite put into words, something that made me feel like I had something to prove every time we faced off. The bell rang, and the match began. Diego darted toward me, his speed catching me off guard as he dodged my first attempt to grab him. He smirked, a smug expression that made my blood boil. "You're slowing down, Titan," he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. I growled, charging at him again, but he slipped away like a shadow, landing a swift kick to my side. The crowd erupted as he played to their cheers, his confidence infuriating me even more. But I wasn't about to let him control the match. I waited for my moment, baiting him into a corner before slamming him into the mat with a thunderous move. The arena shook with the impact, and for a brief second, I saw something in his eyes, something that looked like respect. The match raged on, each of us pushing the other to the limit. By the time the final bell rang, we were both exhausted, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. Diego had won this time, pinning me in a move so quick I barely saw it coming. As he stood over me, victorious, he extended a hand to help me up. I hesitated, glaring at him, but something in his expression caught me off guard. It wasn't arrogance or mockery. It was almost like an invitation, a gesture of camaraderie I hadn't expected. I took his hand reluctantly, and as he pulled me to my feet, he leaned in close, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You're better than you think, Titan," he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. I stared at him, confused and annoyed, as he walked away, leaving me alone in the ring. The crowd roared his name, but my focus was on him, on the man who had beaten me yet again but left me with more questions than answers. After the match, I retreated to the locker room, my body sore and my ego bruised. The sound of the crowd still echoed faintly in the background, but I couldn't focus on anything except Diego's parting words. "You're better than you think, Titan." The way he had said it, with that infuriating smirk and the glint of something unreadable in his eyes. It had stayed with me. I threw my towel onto the bench, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me didn't seem like a winner. Not tonight. My jaw tightened as I replayed the match in my mind, the moment Diego had pinned me, the confidence in his every move. He was good, too good, and I hated that I couldn't deny it. As I was lost in thought, the sound of the locker room door opening snapped me back to reality. I turned to see Diego walking in, still in his wrestling gear, his hair damp with sweat. He didn't look like someone who had just finished a grueling match. He looked composed, his presence filling the room as if he belonged everywhere he stepped. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone sharper than intended. He shrugged, leaning casually against the lockers. "Relax, Titan. I'm not here to gloat." "Could have fooled me," I muttered, grabbing my water bottle and taking a long drink to avoid looking at him. Diego chuckled, that low, infuriating laugh that always seemed to get under my skin. "You're always so tense," he said, shaking his head. "Ever think about loosening up a bit?" I set the bottle down, glaring at him. "What do you want, Diego?" He paused for a moment, his expression shifting slightly. For once, he didn't look cocky or smug. "You fought well tonight," he said, his voice unexpectedly sincere. "I mean it." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was messing with me. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," he said, taking a step closer. "Look, I know we've got this whole rivalry thing going on, but you've got talent, Chris. Real talent. And maybe it's time we stopped pretending we hate each other." I stared at him, his words catching me off guard. Was this the same Diego who spent years taunting me, humiliating me in front of thousands of fans? And now he wanted to play nice? Before I could respond, he pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to me. "There's a bar a few blocks from here," he said. "I'm heading there for a drink. Join me." I glanced at the card, then back at him. "Why would I do that?" He smirked, his eyes glinting with that familiar spark of challenge. "Because maybe you'll find out I'm not as bad as you think." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there with the card in my hand and 100 questions racing through my mind. The bar Diego mentioned was tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless someone told you about it. It wasn't flashy or loud, just a small, dimly lit pub with a handful of patrons scattered across wooden tables. I hesitated outside, the cool night air doing little to calm my nerves. What was I even doing here? Every instinct told me to turn around and go back to my hotel, but something about Diego's invitation lingered in my mind. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Diego spotted me almost immediately. He was seated at the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, and when he saw me, that familiar smirk spread across his face. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said, motioning for me to join him. "Neither did I admitted, taking the seat next to him. The bartender approached, and Diego ordered me a drink before I could even ask for one. "Whiskey okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, trying to act casual, though my mind was racing. This felt strange. Sitting here with Diego, away from the arena, away from the ring, it was like stepping into a different world. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "what's this about? You're not exactly known for hanging out with your rivals." Diego leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Maybe I'm tired of being rivals," he said simply. I blinked, not expecting that answer. "What do you mean?" He looked at me, his expression softer than I'd ever seen. "Chris, we've been at each other's throats for years. And don't get me wrong, it's been fun, great for the fans too. But lately, I don't know. It feels like there's more to this than just competition." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. Was he saying what I thought he was saying? Diego must have noticed my confusion because he smiled and shook his head. Relax, Titan. I'm not trying to freak you out. I'm just saying, maybe we don't have to keep this wall between us. Maybe we could actually get to know each other. I laughed nervously, taking a sip of the whiskey the bartender had just placed in front of me. You sure know how to throw a guy off balance? Part of my charm, he said, grinning. Despite myself, I found it hard to stay guarded around him. The Diego I was seeing now wasn't the arrogant showman from the ring. He was human, genuine, and it was disarming. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing more easily than I'd expected. Diego told me about his childhood in Mexico, how he'd grown up idolizing wrestlers and dreaming of making it big. He talked about the sacrifices he'd made to get here, the family he rarely saw, and the pressure of living up to everyone's expectations. For the first time, I saw him not as the Panther, but as Diego, a man who had fought his way through life just like I had. By the time we left the bar, the city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. As we walked, Diego glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. You're not what I expected, Chris, he said. Is that a good thing? I asked, half joking. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a big match. But this time, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was something else, something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. The night air was cool and still as Diego and I walked side by side, the silence between us strangely comfortable. The tension that usually defined our interactions was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginnings of something deeper. We reached a small park, its benches empty and its pathways lit by soft lamplight. Diego stopped near a fountain, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. Do you ever feel like you're always fighting? He asked suddenly, his voice low. I frowned, unsure of what he meant. What do you mean? He turned to face me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. In the ring, outside of it. Like no matter where you go, you're always trying to prove something, to someone or maybe just to yourself. His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. Yeah, I said finally. I feel that way all the time. It's like, if I'm not fighting, what am I even doing? Diego nodded, his jaw tightening. I used to think that too. But lately, I've started to wonder if there's more to life than the fight. I studied him, caught off guard by his vulnerability. This wasn't the cocky, arrogant Diego I had spent years resenting. This was someone else. Someone who was starting to feel less like a rival and more like... I pushed the thought away, not ready to finish it. What about you? Diego asked, his dark eyes searching mine. What do you want out of all this? I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. I've been so focused on winning, on being the best, that I don't think I've ever stopped to ask myself what I actually want. Diego stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze making my heart pound. Maybe it's time you did, he said softly. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. The sound of the fountain faded, and the cool night air felt electric. Diego was standing so close now that I could feel the warmth of his presence, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. I don't know what this is, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But it feels... different. Diego smiled, a small, almost shy curve of his lips. Maybe different is exactly what we need. And then, before I could think too much about it, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first. But when I didn't pull away, The kiss deepened. It was soft and slow, filled with a tenderness I hadn't realized either of us was capable of. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I've been wanting to do that for a long time," he admitted, his voice low and unsteady. I couldn't help but laugh softly, the weight of the moment tempered by the absurdity of how we'd gotten here. "You have a funny way of showing it." Diego grinned, his cocky confidence returning for just a moment. "I like to keep you on your toes, Titan." The morning after our kiss, the reality of what had happened between Diego and me hit like a freight train. In the ring, we were rivals. To the world, we were enemies. But now, everything felt different. I sat in the locker room before our next match, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My mind replayed the kiss from the night before, his warmth, his tenderness, the way he had looked at me afterward like I was more than just a rival. My heart raced at the memory, but it also carried a weight of uncertainty. What did this mean for us, for our careers? Before I could spiral further, the door opened and Diego walked in. He looked as calm and confident as ever, his usual smirk in place. But when our eyes met, there was something softer beneath the surface. "Hey," he said, closing the door behind him. "Hey," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He leaned against the lockers, crossing his arms over his chest. "You've been avoiding me." "I haven't been." I started to protest, but his raised eyebrow cut me off. "Okay, maybe I have," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. I don't know how to do this, Diego. This isn't exactly what either of us signed up for." Diego nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. We didn't plan for this, but I'm not about to pretend it didn't happen." I looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "Aren't you worried about what people will say? About how this could affect everything?" "Of course I am," he said, stepping closer. "But I'm more worried about losing something that feels real. And this, whatever this is, it feels real to me, Chris." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I found myself standing, closing the space between us. "It feels real to me, too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Diego's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension melted away. "Then maybe we stop overthinking and just see where this goes." The sound of the stage announcer echoed through the locker room, signaling that it was time for our match. Diego glanced toward the door, then back at me, his smirk returning. "Let's give them a show, Titan." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You're impossible." "That's why you like me," he shot back, winking before heading toward the door. As we stepped into the arena, the roar of the crowd enveloped us. The bright lights and electric energy a stark contrast to the quiet moments we had shared. Diego and I locked eyes across the ring, and for a second, I saw something in his gaze that no one else could see. A flicker of understanding, of something more than rivalry. The match began, and we moved with the precision of two people who knew each other's every move. The crowd cheered as we delivered hit after hit, but beneath the choreography, there was something different. A new dynamic, a connection that only we understood. By the time the match ended, with Diego pinning me once again, the line between the ring and the real world felt blurrier than ever. As he stood over me, victorious, he extended a hand to pull me up. This time I didn't hesitate. His grip was firm, his smile softer than usual as he leaned in close. "We make a good team," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. As the crowd roared around us, I couldn't help but smile. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope. In the ring, Diego and I maintained the facade of fierce rivals, but outside of it, everything had changed. Every stolen moment, whether it was a quiet dinner after a match or a late-night conversation in a dimly lit hotel room, felt like a victory, a small rebellion against the world that expected us to hate each other. But the closer we became, the harder it was to keep the lines from blurring. The wrestling world thrived on drama and spectacle, and any sign of vulnerability could be seen as weakness. We both knew the risks, but knowing didn't make it any easier. One night, after an especially grueling match, Diego and I sat on the roof of the hotel, overlooking the city lights. The air was cool, and the distant hum of traffic filled the silence between us. "Do you ever think about what would happen if people found out?" I asked, breaking the quiet. Diego didn't answer right away. He stared out at the skyline, his expression unreadable. "All the time," he admitted finally. "But I'm done hiding who I am, Chris. I've spent too many years pretending to be someone else. And if this, us, means risking everything, then so be it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Diego had always been fearless in the ring, but hearing that same fearlessness applied to something so personal left me breathless. "I don't know if I'm as brave as you," I said quietly. Diego turned to me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "You don't have to be brave all the time," he said. "That's why we're in this together." The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we could make this work. But the world had other plans. The next morning, headlines exploded across social media. Rivals or lovers, wrestlers, Chris Michaels and Diego Ramirez caught together after match. Someone had seen us leaving the arena together, and the photos were everywhere. Grainy but unmistakable. The wrestling world, always hungry for drama, pounced on the story, and within hours, our phones were flooded with calls and messages. Diego took it in stride, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to my growing panic. "It was bound to happen eventually," he said, shrugging as he scrolled through the endless stream of reactions. "Diego, this could ruin us," I said, pacing the room. He stood, crossing the space between us and grabbing my shoulders. "Chris, listen to me. The only thing that can ruin us is if we let them dictate how we live our lives." His confidence steadied me, and I nodded, though the fear still lingered. In the days that followed, the reaction was mixed. Some fans were supportive, applauding us for being honest and brave. Others weren't so kind, their words laced with hatred and ignorance. But through it all, Diego never wavered, and his strength became my anchor. One evening, as we stood in the locker room before another match, I turned to him. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. He smiled, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and defiant. "I've never been more sure of anything." As we stepped into the arena, the crowd roared, their cheers and jeers blending into a cacophony of sound. Diego glanced at me, his smirk returning. "Let's give them something to talk about." The match was electrifying, every move charged with emotion. And when it ended, with both of us standing in the ring, Diego grabbed the mic, his voice echoing through the arena. "This man," he said, pointing to me, "isn't just my rival. He's the person who's changed my life." The crowd erupted, their reaction a mix of shock and admiration. I stood there, my heart pounding as Diego turned to me, his expression unguarded. "And I'm done pretending otherwise," he said, dropping the mic and pulling me into an embrace that left no room for doubt. The arena exploded in cheers, and for the first time, I felt free. Sometimes love demands that we face the world head-on, no matter the risks. Diego and Chris's story reminds us that the strongest fights aren't won in the ring, but in our hearts. What would you do if you had to choose between love and fear? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that inspire, challenge, and move you.